Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Luke Combs called What You See Is What You Get. So, I'm not too proud to admit that I screwed up in a big way by not reviewing Luke Combs' debut album. Now, to be completely fair to myself, at the time I'm not sure anyone could have predicted how fast Luke Combs would rise in the cultural conversation in mainstream country, especially off that badly produced, overmixed clunkers that passed for many of his singles. I mean, at best, they were tepid or kind of amusing in a very middle-brow Tim McGraw sort of way, trafficking in broad relatability and underdog charm rather than much of the way of sharp songwriting or emotive punch, and when you tack on middling to outright bad production, I just was not all that interested outside of a passing fondness for When It Rains It Pours. Kind of an underrated single. And over the past couple of years, Luke Combs' star has risen high and fast, because as much as I might find that approach kind of underwhelming or predictable, to mainstream country listeners it reflected a middle-of-the-road accessibility that wasn't always seen in the increasingly slick and anonymous dregs of bro country that have stuck around, or the broad neo-traditional pivot of John Party in his lane, much less the more untamed and experimental indie country scene, coupled with the fact that he looked the part of every down-home country boy who might be a little bit rough around the edges, but had the best of intentions at heart, and I'm not at all surprised that his mass appeal blew up across the industry, radio, and audiences. What surprised me is that it happened so fast. Now, what I was more concerned about was how this would translate to the second album, especially as the singles seemed to reflect a more organic and thoughtful pivot, and while I knew he would never dive completely into that lane, I did have some expectations, albeit a little bit tempered, especially as I knew he would never fully ditch all the overproduction. But hey, what did we find on What You See Is What You Get? Well, honestly, if there is an album that is the definition of trailing edge material for me, it would probably be this new album from Luke Combs. It's a project that seems weapons targeted at the silent majority, meat and potatoes, mainstream country scene, but in playing so middlebrow, it just leaves me little to say or really analyze about it. But here's the thing, just because it plays to this sound and style doesn't mean that it can't work for me. There's plenty of artists who do that, and there's some truth to acts that are playing down the middle and producing consistently great work, especially in country. So, does Luke Combs deliver that at least? Well, no, not really, but it is better than his debut album by a considerable margin, and I do understand enough of his appeal in order to appreciate this album, even if I would not put him among my favorites anytime soon, even in the mainstream. I do think this is pretty good, but I will not say this is great. And a big part of this comes from the fact that while Luke Combs doesn't really do a ton wrong in mainstream country, I'd struggle to say from a production and composition standpoint that he does a lot right either. Yeah, he's got a solid rasp and a warm range to his vocal timbre, conveying the sort of hangdog charisma that's naturally pretty populist without feeling oversold, but it's a damn shame that most of his backing vocals are pitched higher than his voice, or don't really match his gruffer style, or worse still when we get an obviously synthetic smeared over layer that adds nothing to his voice, doesn't even really fit. And that's kind of indicative of the album as a whole. There's a strong core sound that overall is pretty strong and melodic, but the guitar layers often sound so overblown or oversold at the expense of an adequate foundation in the bass line. And that's before you tack on the saloon pianos or touches of fiddle or even Maverick's saxophone on Lovin' On You or Angels Working Overtime, which might carry more punch if they were mixed in a way to accentuate some of those tones rather than just oversaturate the mid-range. And while I know it's basically a crapshoot to ask for Luke Combs to bring any sort of broader dynamics or flow to this album, you can really say that about a lot of mainstream country acts, it's hard not to consider this album a little two-dimensional when it adheres to very conventional chord progressions and doesn't really modulate a lot of its tempo or tone. For an album that runs nearly an hour for over 17 songs, it's hard to avoid the suspicion that this, if it had been chopped down, otherwise rote or forgettable songs could have been left on the drawing board and we'd have a more focused project. Not saying that the beats that Luke Combs hits are bad in terms of obvious duds. I'd say overall this album doesn't really have any, but there's a lot of filler here here, and I'm left thinking that what would stand out more with more focus and refinement, and you sure as hell didn't have to tack on his EP, The Prequel, to open up this album, even if it did give us Even Though I'm Leaving, which might still be the best song here thanks to the terrific mandolin work. Now, all that being said, for as much as we get the very obvious mainstream concessions like the drum machine slipping onto Moon Over Mexico and All Over Again that are trying for a little bit more spacey atmospherics and will likely be the singles, I will give Luke Combs credit for making this a lot more country than he probably needed to in order to satisfy that middlebrow audience. And the obvious comparison and example comes in one of the lead-off singles, and honestly I'm surprised it was a single, One Too Many with Brooks and Dunn, which, especially when you consider the overlayered burly guitars on the up-tempo tracks, it's the obvious point of influence, especially when you consider cuts like Every Little Bit Helps, the title track, and especially Angels Working Overtime. And you know what? The brighter the songs tend to be, the better off they are. More often than not, Luke Combs playing the honest, self-aware, but oft-ignored underdog, and when he can be frank about his flaws and failings, it burnishes that populist side really effectively, especially as you can tell that he's always focusing on fixing the things he can and moving on and acknowledging what he can't, which comes through really well in the post-breakup songs New Every Day and Every Little Bit Helps. And where Luke Combs also does really well are in the little details. A song like Refrigerator Door works so well because, while nobody else might really care about what's on that refrigerator door, the little meaning for him, it goes beyond and he can sell it. It's familiar, but unique and idiosyncratic to him. And it's a formula that works so well, he actually kind of repeats it to greater effect with Eric Church on Does to Me, only this time focusing more on small moments and actions that mean more. Now, all that being said, there are a few issues with this approach, the first being that for as oversold and broad as the production can be, it doesn't always match the smaller scope and framing in the writing. This is where dynamics would help. And it's also intertwined with the second issue. Dig even a little bit deeper into the emotional or thematic subtext, and this album can feel pretty thin. It's not exactly aiming high or going subtle, if you catch my drift. And look, for this style of mainstream accessible country, there's nothing wrong with keeping it basic and straightforward, but I'm not sure it lets the more unique side of Luke Combs' writing pop as much as it really could. And I did find myself wishing that there be at least a little bit more emotional complexity or thematic weight. I mean, the details really catch my attention, and the best songs they do come out for me, but as a whole, the filler drags this album back from landing more effectively. But you know what, to wrap it all up, this is an improvement for Luke Combs, and I can see this thing selling like gangbusters. But overall, beyond a few cuts, I'm just kind of lukewarm on it. It reminds me a lot of You Should Be Here, Cole Swindell's second album from 2016, that shows an artist that's moving past an underwhelming or sterile debut by leaning into warmer, richer tones that lean more on the actual countryside that they loved growing up, and a very prominent Brooks and Dunn influence, with the best songs focusing on emotional honesty, maturity, and the relationships they had with their fathers, which is really fertile ground for both acts, and I'll admit I'm a bit of a sucker for it. But you can also tell it was a little bit compromised to get to that point, and I just know that Luke Combs is going to get stuck with the more sterile and programmed singles pushed to radio, unless Even Though I'm Leaving becomes enormous. And even then, I'm going to be watching closely to see if he can take that populism even further. But as it is right now, I'm thinking a very strong 6 out of 10, cautious recommendation, but you might want to pick and choose the cuts you like rather than the album as a whole. Again, it's more of a singles and individual songs focused project than more of an album work. But as it is, I got some hope for this guy. Certainly likable enough, so I don't know. See how it turns out. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Not really a lot to say, but I did want to actually say something about Luke Combs, given that I missed him around the first time, and Even Though I'm Leaving, it's a phenomenal song. But if you want to buy or stream the album, links down there below, and I got the poll up there. I'm curious where the Luke Combs fans fall on this, because I know this guy's got a diehard fan base, and they might come down on me a little hard for calling this a little basic and not really going as deep as it could. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you're looking for other album reviews or the newest episode of Billboard Breakdown, links to the card right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time. What you see is what you